Thank you all for being here. I think the last time I gave a talk here would have been 25 months ago for All Blood Runs Red with Phil Keith, my friend, and a friend to some others of you here. And so it's really especially good. Of course, I didn't look out at a sea of masks when I was here 25 months ago, but it is what it is. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Some of you might know what the basic plot of Lightning Down is. And it's about it's told through the eyes of one participant. It's a nonfiction book. It's not fiction, not novels. Everything in here happened. And it's the story of Joe Moser, who is my eyes and ears of the experience of the largely untold story about 168 Allied pilots who in 1944, or when they were captured, were not sent to a prisoner of war camp, but were sent to Buchenwald. And that's a story that was hidden for many, many years. And I might anticipate one of your questions that I usually get asked about not just this book, but other books too. Well, how did you get the idea? And I'm giving a little bit away by answering that question, but I think it's going to help me set the stage a little bit for what I'm about to say. I was doing research on something else. Something else had to do with airmen, flyers, World War II, whatever, in December of 2015. So you're talking about a 6-year journey that this book took. And I came across an obituary for a man named Joe Moser. And this was in a state of Washington weekly newspaper. That he just died at 94 years old. And one of the things that I think has helped me, and has helped certainly a lot of other writers, is the curiosity. Because it looked like a standard obituary, so why should I bother to keep reading it? But I do. I read the back of cereal boxes. That's what I do. And so I was scanning it, and something jumped out at me that he was one of 168 pilots sentenced to die in Buchenwald. And so I said, gosh, I got to find out a little more about that. So that's where the journey began. And to tell you his story, Joe grew up. He was born and raised on a farm in the state of Washington. And his father died when he was 12, so he took over the farm when he was only 12 or 13 years old for his widowed mother, his younger brother, and 2 sisters. And maybe it was just wish fulfillment or whatever, or an escape he wanted to do. But when he'd be out in the field, a plane would fly overhead, he'd always say, "Oh, I really want to be a pilot, but that's probably never going to happen because I'm going to live the rest of my life on this farm." But then came Pearl Harbor, which, as many of you know, was 80 years ago yesterday. And he, like tens of thousands of other young men at the time, he enlisted. And he saw this opportunity. He joined the Army with the idea, is there any chance I could be an Army pilot? And so he actually qualified for it. Months and months and months and months of training and learning, of flying. So it wasn't until the spring of 1944 that his squadron was sent over to Europe, to an air base in England. And it was from that air base in England, this was before D-Day, at that air base in England, that the American Allied pilots, the majority of them by this point were American, flew across the Channel to bomb occupied France and sometimes into Germany itself. And Joe flew a P-38 Lightning. That's kind of a unique plane. It was a versatile plane because it was used as both a light bomber and as a fighter plane. Joe loved the plane. It's one of the reasons why he took so much time in training, because it's not an easy plane to learn. They also found these pilots of P-38s that a drawback it had. It wasn't an easy plane to bail out of. It had these twin booms connected at the back. So some pilots would jump out of the cockpit and they'd go flying back and get caught on the back of the plane and go down with the plane. Then D-Day came, and he and his squadron moved to France when they could. Their mission started from there. They were both attack planes and bomber escorts. So in August, it was August 13th, 1944, Joe was on his 44th combat mission. That's kind of significant because he was still only 22 years old. He was flying his 44th mission. And during these months that he would fly in these missions, as the book goes into some detail, he'd see colleagues of the pilots have their planes shot down. Sometimes they'd see somebody bail, he'd see a parachute, sometimes not. He'd come back from his mission that day and find the guy who was in the bunk next to him didn't come back and never heard from him again. So, there was this constant tension, but as he got closer, if he got to 50 missions, he was going home. And that was his big dream. I'm doing my duty, and then I've got 50 missions, I'm gonna go home. I can't wait to see my mother, I can't wait to see my brother, I can't wait to see my sisters. I can't believe I ever wanted to get off that farm. I can't wait to get back to the farm. So he's on his 44th mission, and he gets hit. His plane goes on fire. He's trying to make it back to Allied lines, but the flames won't let him. He has to get out. So he's stuck in the cockpit. So he actually tries something different because he's worried that he's gonna come out. He or his parachute's gonna get caught on the tail of the plane. So he actually turns his plane upside down and drops out, and head first, and has the wherewithal when he straightens out to hit his parachute. The parachute opens up. His plane crash lands, explodes in this farm field, and he lands very close to where his plane is burning. And a number of young French farmers are there, and they try to help him escape. But the Germans had seen this burning plane coming down. They saw the smoke from the explosion. They arrive very quickly. They take Joe prisoner, and he thinks, he's not very happy about this, of course, but he's in one piece. He was only slightly wounded. He's in one piece, and he figures, okay, well, maybe the war won't last much longer, and I'll spend the rest of it in a POW camp. His worst fates. That night he's kept in a cellar. The next day he's brought to a prison near Paris, where he's severely interrogated. Now, he's kind of surprised, but he's, okay, I understand that. They're trying to find out, they're asking him where his squadron is located, who the pilots in the squadron, information. He understands, they're trying to get information that they could use against us. So his every response, though, is name, rank, and serial number. So finally he's thrown into this prison, which has the most horrific conditions. This prison is constant torture going on, people are being killed, murdered, and he's wondering, why am I here? I'm not supposed to be here. I wasn't not a spy. I'm an Allied pilot. I should be treated with the Geneva Convention. And that was just the tip of the iceberg for him, because what happens is the Allies are closing in on Paris. This is mid-August 1944. The Allies are getting closer and closer. So the Germans decide they're going to empty the prison out of about 2,000 people, put them on a train, and off they go, which is what happened. These prisoners, Joe and the others, put on this train, actually put in cattle cars, not passenger trains, they're stuffed into cattle cars so tightly that during the journey, if somebody faints, there's no room to drop. They have one 5-gallon bucket of water per car for all these men, up to 90 men per car. So the other presumption is, okay, whenever we arrive at our destination, it's going to be a POW camp. 5 days and 5 nights they're on this train. Day after day after day. And I won't go into details, but it's an awful, awful experience. Not everybody survives. And one of the things that Joe finds out on this train ride is that he's not the only one being treated this way. There were 167 other Allied pilots who were on this train with him, who were sent to this prison, and who are, wherever they're going, this is where they're all going together. And that sounds like very mysterious, but they'll sort it out once they get to the POW camp. And then they'll be in touch with the Red Cross, and the Red Cross can let their families know they're okay, whatever. So after 5 days and 5 nights, the train doors open up, and they look out, and there's all these SS guards holding, barely restraining German shepherds. And behind these things of wire are these skeletal, filthy prisoners staring out at them, hundreds and hundreds of them. And some of the people realize, we're at a concentration camp, we're not at a POW camp, what are we doing here? So all the prisoners get out, and it becomes clear, frighteningly clear, that yes, this is what their fate is. And as it turns out, they were told, it was told that these flyers were to be sent to Buchenwald, as some of you know, one of the most notorious of the Nazi concentration camps. And the idea was that they were just sent there to die as quickly as possible, to get them off the map and out of the Germans' embarrassment that they were treating them this way. So that's what Joe and the other pilots found out, that there wasn't even any place to house them. You know, for 2 months, their barracks was a stone plaza, which got with 1 blanket per 3 men. And when the nights in September and October are colder and colder, that was pretty bad. So an important, a sizable part of the story is that how they try and survive. Day after day, week after week, they're not treated any differently from the other prisoners there. The other prisoners are Poles, Jews, Russians, Gypsies, a whole bunch of undesirables according to the Nazi government. And they're not treated any different. They're given the same thing everybody else has to eat, which is some thin soup where the only protein in it is the maggots. They have the same beatings, the same torture, the same treatment as the Nazi guards, who basically had carte blanche to do whatever they wanted if they felt like it. And so as time went on, they're subjected to the same conditions, their bodies react the same way as the others. They're losing weight because they're hardly eating, they're suffering from malnutrition, they start suffering from dysentery, diphtheria, pneumonia. Joe's down at one point to 105 pounds. And one way that they survived, not all of them survived, but one way they survived as long as they did, is that there was a particular officer who they found out was, when they got things sorted out, okay, who's the senior officer here of 168 of us? And it turned out to be a man, Colonel Philip Lamison, who was a New Zealand pilot. So he took charge. And in the book, those of you who get a chance to read it, you'll see he's compared to, many of you have seen the movie The Bridge Over the River Kwai, and Colonel Nicholson, who's played by Alec Guinness. This guy is Alec Guinness, but without the madness. Okay, he doesn't go crazy like the Alec Guinness character does in there. Colonel Lamison says, listen, he inspires them in 2 ways. One, he tells them the way we're going to survive is maintain discipline, just as if we were back at our own bases back home. We march together, we eat together, we do everything together, we help each other, if we fall down, we lift each other up. If we don't have enough to eat, and you can spare 2 spoonfuls of the soup, give it to the guy next to you. And the other way he inspires them is by defying the German officers and guards, because they keep trying to get the flyers to work in these factories next to the Buchenwald camp. And it's against the Geneva Convention that you work in a factory that's making munitions to go kill your own people. So there are many times when he's beaten with rifles, when they put a gun to his head, with fingers on the trigger, they sick German shepherds on him, and he just keeps getting right back up again and saying, I won't do what you're telling us to do, we won't do it. So that was a big part of helping them survive, that's kind of inspired leadership. So finally, they're not dying, or at least dying fast enough and conveniently enough, because the idea was die, throw them in the ovens. So that Hitler gets frustrated, because he doesn't want to put out there, and other senior German officers don't want to put out there, that these prisoners are here, that they've done something terribly illegal, major war crime. But they're not dying, at least quickly and efficiently enough. So finally Hitler gives the order to the commandant of Buchenwald to execute them. So Lamison hears through the grapevine, it's either through the Russians or the communists, who at that time were not the same thing necessarily, that the execution date's been set. He doesn't tell the other men, he's afraid they'll do something desperate and all get killed. He's got to figure out what can we do in the meantime. And he tries one thing after another, it doesn't work, and then he does the equivalent of what's a Hail Mary pass. One of his pilots, at least one of his pilots, speaks and writes German. So they write a note and they smuggle it to a Luftwaffe base that's near Buchenwald. They're thinking, well, one of the pilots there hears about, Allied pilots, maybe they'll intervene, do something about it. And this is where they have a major stroke of luck. The note makes its way into the hands of a man named Hannes Traubloff, who was a colonel. He was not only a high-ranking officer in the Luftwaffe, but he was an ace of Germany. He was one of their major aces as a flyer. He was not a Nazi, but he was in the German Air Force and he fought for his country. So he gets this note and he's, at the very least, perplexed. He said, this can't be possible. We don't treat enemy pilots like this. And it's kind of like it's like this Red Baron, like code of honor left over from World War II. The pilots respect each other and salute each other. As I think one of the guys going down, happy landings. He said, I gotta find out if this is true. So under the pretext of needing some reason to inspect Buchenwald, he and his adjutant go to the camp. Now, this is the last guy that the SS officers and the commandant of Buchenwald want to see. So they keep steering him, trying to steer him away from the pilots, all the hundreds of people up against the fences, as Troutloff looks around and supposedly inspecting the place. He was under the mistaken impression that he would be able to spot the pilots right away, because they're Allied pilots, they're not typical Buchenwald prisoners. He didn't realize that by this point, they looked just like everybody else. They're wearing filthy rags, skeletal faces, the haunted look on their faces, barely could stand. So after a while, and these guys had guns trained on them too, like don't say a word. So after a while, he's about to turn away and leave the camp thinking, okay, the whole thing was a bit of a hoax. When one of the pilots who could speak German calls out, risking his life, saying, we're here, we're Allied pilots. So Troutloff goes over there and they try, the SS guys are trying to get him out of there. They're trying to drag him away. And he says, no, I outrank you guys. You know, you can't, I'm staying here, I'm talking to these people. And so he gets the lowdown that there's 168, however many were left by that point, pilots here, and he is absolutely appalled at this treatment. This is not the way you do things. Also, as a practical measure, if the Germans are doing this to the Allied pilots, what's to stop the Allied camp directors from doing this to German pilots, captured German pilots? So he goes back to his base and he composes a note that gets sent directly to, because he has this kind of juice, goes right to the top of Luftwaffe Command and Hermann Göring. Now, if there's one tiny thing that could take a few hours off Göring's million-year sentence in hell, because of the monster that he was, it was that he too was appalled. And he wrote an order overruling Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS and in charge of all the concentration camps, saying these prisoners must be freed. And they were, a few days later, sent to a POW camp. Now, some of you are going to think, is that the end of the story? Because so much of it is about the, I just want to look for something here, and I'll just be a second because I don't want to miss something here. Just give me a moment. Oh, here we go. All right. Okay. As you see, I'm not reading from the book. I'm actually just telling you the story. But I am going to read one thing in just a couple of minutes. Okay, good news. It's not the end of the story. There's a lot more to go. Buchenwald turns out to be one terrible part on Joe Moser's entire journey. There's more to come. There's a respite. They're sent to a regular prisoner of war camp. They're there for a couple of months. They start to regain some of their strength. But then it gets into like the third or fourth week in January 1945. The Allies are coming from this direction. The Russians are coming from this direction. So the Germans, there's 10,000 prisoners in this camp that's built for like 3,000. The Germans decide we've got to get them out of here and march them deeper into Germany to another camp. And it turns out that this is one of the worst winters of the 20th century. And yet these 10,000 prisoners, okay, they open up the gates, start marching. You know, whoever's left alive and gets to that camp, good. If you don't make it, you don't make it. And as it turns out, this particular event of 10,000 prisoners marching deeper into Germany during this terrible winter and the terrible conditions became known as the Death March, because of the 10,000, 1,500 didn't make it. Joe is one of these prisoners. And so day after day, night after night, day after day, they're marching through. It's 20 below zero, it's snowing, it's the wind, it's everything like this. And there's one part where I just want to read about Joe's experience here. So if you'll indulge me. 1 mile, 2, the one after that, the frozen and exhausted men shuffled forward. Every so often one dropped and a guard would drag the prisoner to the side of the road, out of the way. Sometimes a gunshot would follow. Sometimes a bullet was not necessary. The hint of the sun through the clouds was directly overhead, and then it crawled through the cruel afternoon. Joe idly wondered which step would be his last, when he would finally find it impossible to put one foot in front of the other, when he would fall to his knees and then pitch forward onto his face. and then a guard, perhaps with an ounce of sympathy, but probably only a heavy weariness, would haul him off to the side of the road. However, as though a miracle were occurring, later in the afternoon, Joe began to feel better. It was like he had broken through to the other side of pain and exhaustion. He experienced a growing warmth, and with it a growing sense of well-being. Something deep inside of him seemed to be saying that he was going to be okay, that he was going to go home and it would feel so good. That feeling expanded within him, now I'm quoting Joe himself. What started as a surprising sense of acceptance and peace slowly began turning to a kind of euphoria. The snow and cold and wind seemed to fill me with a kind of joy and anticipation. It was almost as if I was outside myself, watching myself getting warmer, more peaceful, and even joyful. It seemed the sky was lightening. It didn't seem so hard now. I could go on like this forever and ever. Joe was not aware that the euphoria was the sensation experienced by those about to die from a combination of hypothermia and exhaustion. After a few more unsteady steps, darkness flooded his mind, and he collapsed. A final thought was that his fear of being left to die on a lonely road in a country thousands of miles from home was about to be realized. Now, if you want to know what happened, you have to read the book. Okay, I already gave away, you know. I mean, I started this talk by saying I found his obituary, who died at 94. So he survived. I don't want to give away how he miraculously survives being, you know, seconds away from death. And then his next adventure after that, where he's seconds away from death. And his journey home, which is a torturous experience. But Joe does eventually make it home, and the reason why I want to mention that and even give that away a little bit is I want to emphasize that there's some rough stuff in this book. I mean, you can't treat the stay of these people in Buchenwald like it's Hogan's Heroes. Okay, Colonel Philip Lamison was one of those who also survived. He died at 93, and on his farm in New Zealand. And when I was contacting his family in New Zealand, and his kids would say, very few times they ever asked him about what was it like in Buchenwald, because he wouldn't talk about it. His only response was, whatever you've heard about Buchenwald, it was worse. And that's all he would say. But Joe, the book to me anyway, I certainly felt this way when I was writing it, is I think quite uplifting. Joe's experiences, his transformation, I don't want to give too much of that away, but he undergoes a transformation. And part of that is because of even events that take place later in his life directly related to his imprisonment. So I hope those of you that get a chance to read it will stick with it. I think a big reason why you will, other than to find out what happens, because like I say, it's one death-defying experience after another, is that Joe Moser is such a fascinating, to me, character. He was a quiet, humble young man when he entered the service. He spent the rest of his life as a quiet, humble man. And one advantage of him being quiet is that he didn't want the attention on himself, and he wasn't one to talk much. But he was keenly observing of what's going on around him, of other people, of events. So it was a great advantage, great benefit to me to find that if I needed somebody to guide us through this story, it was going to be somebody who was keenly aware of his surroundings and actually lived long enough to write about his experiences and sometimes some vivid detail, not literary detail, just very observant, very direct kind of statements about what he experienced. So, without nattering away any further, I hope you have some questions. Please do. Please let me know. Yes, sir.
The part that you read, the excerpt from the book, it's like you were inside his head.
Yes.
How did you get that information as to what he was thinking and what he was doing if he passed away? You said something now about he had written about it.
Yes. Joe, when Joe was in his 80s, he didn't know how much longer. He was surprised he lived that long, and he didn't know how much longer he had. So he he approached, he had a friend, and Joe was born and raised on a farm in Ferndale, Washington, and when he got back from the war, he lived the rest of his life in Ferndale, Washington. He had seen the rest of the world he wanted, as much of the rest of the world he wanted to see. And so he had a friend there named Gerald Barron, who was a businessman. And he went to him and said, listen, I'm not a writer. Would you, if I dictated to you some of my experiences and my memories, would you write them down? So, and this was not for publication. This was going to be a privately printed thing that was going to go to family members and friends. And that was the extent of it. So, when I first started to go look to see if I could find anything else about this topic, I mean, I tracked down the Moser family, Ferndale, Bellingham, Washington. Even the kids stayed there. And I contacted the family, and they said, you know, I wanted to say, I said, I'm looking into the researching your father's experiences. Are you okay with that? You know, whatever possible, I'd like to try and be on the up and up with people. It's not possible, not. But they said, yeah. And they said, you know, we have this thing my dad wrote. I was talking to one of the daughters. Would you like to see it? I said, would I? You know, I mean, the phone was still in my hand, and I was out the door. I didn't have to run to Washington, thank goodness. So it was sent to me, and it was very direct writing, a lot of declarative sentences, Joe's experiences of growing up, of being a pilot, of being shot down, of being in Buchenwald, his experiences after that, and his homecoming, which turned out to be infinitely more painful than he ever expected. So this was a great document to have, because this became my centerpiece, my foundation upon all the other research I did could be built upon. So that's why there's several parts in the story, in the book, where the reader will see, observe, and experience things through Joe's eyes, as Joe's experiencing or witnessing them. Like I said, he wasn't one to call attention to himself, but if something else was being called attention to, he was watching, he was observing. So, yes, sir.
By the way, fabulous book. I think it'd be a great movie.
Oh, did you read it?
Yeah. And,
you're the one.
Well, your encapsulation of the story. If I was your agent, I would say never do that again, because you gave such a great encapsulation of the book. But it's even more interesting when you read it. The insight of the World War II men,
yeah,
in this case, and the Allies working together with this esprit and trust,
yeah,
organizing in a prisoner of war camp.
mm-hmm.
The insightfulness of that and the value of that makes this such a powerful book, because that's something that when I give this book to my son to read, it's something I don't think he has in his generation. And we were all in touch with someone from World War II,
yeah,
our families. That's our generation.
mm-hmm.
But our grandchildren and their experience of this is almost make-believe, to see the democracy
Mm-hmm.
and the respect of each other. Those working men who were prisoners of war gave each other as Americans and allies.
Mm-hmm.
That insight is fabulous.
Yeah, thank you. That's a big part of the book, because they, since you read it, you know that Colonel Lamison was an inspiring leader, and he knew, and he explained to them, and they believed him, that the only way we don't die together is we live together and support each other. And reminds me of going back to the Revolutionary War, early in the Revolutionary War. I think it might have been Ben Franklin who said, we either hang together or we hang separately. You know, they were either going to live together, survive together, or each in his own way was going to die from their deprivations. So, did you, sir, have a question?
Yes. What happened to that manuscript, for lack of a better term, the document that he had dictated to the print?
You can actually find it. There's a copy of it. It's subsequently been made available as a privately printed paperback, and you can find it. Actually, find it on Amazon now. And it's called. I think it's called. Oh, I haven't. I want to give you the right title, and I put it here in my acknowledgments. Let me just see if I can find that for you real quick, because you know I mentioned it there, and I want to make sure that I did. Gerald Barron. I think it's called The Lost Airmen of Buchenwald. So there is a possibility, And I highly recommend it because everything in that book is Joe's point of view. He didn't personally write it. He dictated it to Gerald Barron. There's a lot more in this book because I also had the point of view of some of the other pilots, some of the other experiences, and also the larger picture of what was going on in Buchenwald at that time and in the whole concentration camp system. And there were some things that Joe could not tell me. You know, there's a part in the book towards the end. There's a part, one of his other death-defying experiences. It's April 1945. He's in this camp, a prisoner of war camp, that supplies are gone. There's nothing. The Germans are surrendering by the thousands. They have no food left. Even the guards, they're living off stolen Red Cross packages. The prisoners are starving to death, including Joe Moser. And he didn't know what was going on around that camp. So I had to research it to find out how close the Allies, or the American Army, was getting, and how an American general and 5 other men, when they saw that camp was there, and these guards, it's like 200 Germans came running out to meet them. They got in jeeps and went out there. So these general and 5 guys went out to meet these 200 armed Germans, and he told them, you've got to surrender right now, and they didn't. They just laid down their guns. But there's more to that story there. Joe didn't know any of that. He's barely alive. And then, you know, what eventually happens, which is, I think, a pretty emotional part of the book, is that he's barely alive. He's near the front gate, and all of a sudden the gate comes crashing down, and an American tank comes through, and a whole other chapter of his life begins. Yes, Scotty, over there.
At the time this plane was shot down in the summer of 1944,
Yes.
like, how aware were the Allied troops of what a concentration camp was like?
You know, that's a really good question. They were a little bit more aware than the American people back home were. You know, I mean, I'm not saying that nobody in America knew that there were concentration camps going on, but you know, many of even our news organizations knew vaguely of what they were. I mean, certainly you didn't have anybody embedded there who worked for ABC. But some of the Allied troops did because, you know, word got around, you know, and some escapees managed to make it back. People who lived near these concentration camps, the word spread through Germany and through Poland, and then eventually made its way. But when the train got there, and these train crews, sorry, dramatic. You had members of the French resistance who had colleagues who were in these camps, but word was getting out of what was going on in there. But when the train arrived, this particular train that carried these 2,000 people, including Joe Moser, and these doors were opened up, most of these people on the train getting off that train had no idea where they were. Which maybe was a blessing if they all knew, oh my God, we're at a death camp. You know, the first thing, they had to find out, and they found out pretty quickly how horrific the conditions were. You know, and Joe talks about in the book, when he would first see these skeletal, filthy, almost not human people, how awful he felt for them, how sympathetic, how terrible, not knowing that he would be one of them before long. So, anyway, yes?
Is there any mention in Joe's memoirs if he continued flying as a pilot? I know when some of the military people come back, they don't want anything to do with aviation because of their experience. I'm just curious if he used his aviation for farming or anything like that and continued on. Did he teach students or anything?
To my knowledge, from reading his memoir and from talking to family members, while Joe always had a soft spot in his heart for his P-38 that crashed and burned, he never got into a cockpit again. And in fact, let's give you a little bit of something away. He may never have even flown again, any kind of airplane, until he was 88 years old, and he returned to Buchenwald. So you can imagine. But no, when Joe got back home and he finally sorted things out, he became an oil burner repairman. And he did that for decades. And he was known as the friendly oil burner repairman. Yes, sir.
My question goes, did you have any access to the Buchenwald records about these? Because you mentioned that they were found, that was sort of the proof that they were really there.
Yeah, well, I did not, especially since the last year and a half I was working on this book. It was during the pandemic, and there was no way to get over there. There are a number of books that were written by former prisoners of Buchenwald, also written by, there's one especially called the Buchenwald Report, which was published, I think, in 1946, which contains tons and tons of eyewitness accounts and testimonies by prisoners there. And it was a very, it was a great reservoir of information. Now, a lot of things had to be, try to corroborate it with other independent sources. But that in particular, there were other sources, but that in particular, the Buchenwald Report was one that was very, very helpful and useful. And then there were testimonies given by prisoners after the war ended that you can get, they're digitized, you can find them. The American, is it the American Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. has a lot of archival material that's readily available. A lot of it's digitized, or reference librarians can make it available to researchers. So I thought that I had adequate information to write the section of the book about Buchenwald, understanding that the whole book is not about Buchenwald. If I was writing, I think it's like 360 pages, for 360 pages about Buchenwald, I felt like I would have had to go much more extensively researched. But I think for the section on Buchenwald, and of course including Joe's eyewitness accounts of his experiences, I thought pretty much gives a picture there. I also have to keep in mind that Buchenwald being such a place of horror, I wanted to communicate that to the reader, but I don't want the reader at a certain point saying, I can't read this anymore. Because then you won't find out the rest of Joe's journey. So I think that it was a bit of a balancing act. Any other questions? All right, here's your chance.
I have a
Oh,
question.
wait, just
Or
a-
actually a comment about.
Go ahead.
How many of the 68 pilots survived and able to come home?
Approximately 160. So there were some that nobody knows whatever happened to them. And unfortunately for me, although it's understandable, when I started working on the book, the only one still alive was an American who was 102 years old. And he was living in a home, I can't remember if it was in Nevada or Minnesota. Probably Minnesota, people that live longer. And he was not in a condition that he could be helpful to me to work on the book. I discussed this a bit in the book. Many of these pilots, these airmen, turned their backs on their experience and never wanted to deal with it again. And never wrote about it, never spoke about it, never. In fact, Joe Moser, he married, he and his wife had 5 children. It was not until the 1980s he told his wife. Unfortunately, there are a lot of pilots who experienced this same thing Joe Moser did and will never have their testimonies and their stories. Yes, you were going to say something?
What you said before about, or I think a gentleman over there said something about the future generations and how the younger people now would benefit from this type of information. I had read a book, Unbroken, by Laura.
Yes, Laura Hillebrand.
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic book.
Yeah.
When I finished that book, I said, you know what, this is a book that they should be reading in 10th grade so that they can understand not only what the people went through and what this one particular prisoner, whose name escapes me, what he went through as a surviving.
Zapparini.
Yeah,
Yes,
Zapparini.
yes,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
know the movie was made,
Louis.
but is your book, I didn't read it yet, sorry. Do you think that your book would be a book that the younger generation should be reading in our schools to understand the sacrifices that were made and really open up their eyes? Because I don't think they're getting that. And I thought this book would be a great one, and it sounds like yours might be also, just a history
Yeah.
of what happened.
That's a good question. I don't know. Maybe somebody else knows this answer. If Unbroken was ever revised to make it available to like the 10 to 14-year-old group.
It's just a fantastic
Because
book.
it's got some tough sledding in there too, especially its treatment inside the Japanese prisoner of war camp. Somebody who's a teacher of that middle, what they call middle grade readership category, would probably have to look at it and say, I think this might be too much for a 12-year-old. But I agree the story is, and there's another reason why, in addition
When
to
you say
just-
you close the book, you don't want people to close the book up, so
Yeah.
if it's just touching, you know, a little bit on it, it just sounds like it would be a great book for that.
well, you can, when you read it, if you read it, you can let me know.
Okay.
But, so it would, the other reason why, but there's a reason that I felt that it would be good for younger people to read, and that is because of the word resilience. Joe Moser and the others, I mean, some others fared better than others. A big reason why Joe Moser survived is because of his resilience. He was a man of faith. He prayed every day that he was in the concentration and the POW camps. He had this very strong desire that he would not die. He would see his mother and his brother and his sisters again. That idea was in his mind, I will not die. I will, whatever I have to do, I will get home and I will see my family again. So I think that quality of resilience is something that if it could be demonstrated, this helps demonstrate that to a lot of young people who are challenged by all kinds of things. I think it could be helpful. So who knows, maybe somebody will come along and say, yeah, let's do a version of it. It's happened once before. There's a book I did with Bob Drury called The Heart of Everything That Is, about the Lakota Sioux in the 1850s and 60s. It came out in 2013. And we were approached by a publisher who subsequently published a revised version that was aimed just at the 10 to 14-year-old market. I have no idea how it sold. I never saw a royalty check from it. Yes?
I just have a statistical question. If 168 went in and roughly 160 came back out again, was their survival rate higher than the rest of the prisoners that were in?
I would say yes, and a big reason for that is that the longer you're at Buchenwald, the less likely you are to survive. And so they were there, even though they were reduced to the same condition as their fellow prisoners, by the time they were supposed to be executed, they were only there for a little over 2 months. Probably as each week, if not each day went on, more would have died. I mean, it's just conjecture, but Buchenwald was liberated on April, it was either 12th or 13th, 1945. And I think it's quite possible that none of them, or maybe just a handful, would have survived to that point. So the fact that they were there, after 2.5 months they were transferred elsewhere, is a major reason why that many survived, I think. Yes, sir, back there.
Yeah, you obviously interviewed many people in order to write the book. Can you identify those people who were most significant that you interviewed?
You know, this book is really very few interviews because there were very few people around. I mean, there were none of the airmen were alive, like I said, except for the gentleman who's 102. And this is one of the books that's really, when I did a book with Bob Drury that came out in 2007 called Halsey's Typhoon, which is about a typhoon that strikes Halsey's Third Fleet in the Pacific in December 1944. 3 ships were sunk, 900 men went in the water, about between 80 and 90 survived. And when we were working on that book, say 15 years ago, we were able to interview, I think, about 20 of those survivors. And here it was 15 years later, and I'm working on this book, and only one man was still alive who was directly part of that experience. So just in that 15-year period, you've all heard the statistics about how many World War II veterans are passing away every day. So it was to my dismay, but there's nothing I could do about it, that there were none of them still alive. It was one of those things that depended more on if they left behind any oral histories, if they had any diaries. Sometimes you can get lucky that way that, Joe Smith is no longer alive, but his grandson, John Smith, has his diary. There's a book that I've been working on now that's also a World War II story about this medic for a particular battalion in World War II who was killed during this battle. But I managed to locate his son, Jeffrey, in Minnesota, and in the phone conversation with him, he's telling me some anecdotes about his father. Said, "Would you like to see his diary?" Yeah, I think so, And he made a copy of it, sent it to me, and that's the kind of thing that you have to rely on when the principal person is no longer available. So a couple other hands. Yes?
I find it very interesting that even though there was such a large group that did survive, 160, and they survived to a large degree because they stuck together as a unit and they followed their commander's instructions.
Yeah.
Yet, no one, once they got home, that was it. The case was closed. Nobody
Yeah.
spoke ever again about it. I find that they didn't want to connect with each other.
Yes, I'm
for
glad you
some
asked that
moral-
question. Yeah, there's a double whammy here to these particular men. As illustrated by Joe Moser's personal experience, he sort of represents the others in this case. You have, first of all, we've all heard about this, you have so many of the World War II veterans came home and didn't talk about their experiences, those who had seen combat. They couldn't, they wouldn't, whatever. They get a job, get married, have kids, go ahead with your life, get on with it. So Joe was of that generation, and to some extent of that mindset. The other reason is that Joe is typical of what happened to many of these other men. When he was home after 2 weeks, the local, I think it was VFW in Washington, said, "Would you come give a talk about your experiences?" So he's giving his talk, he's talking about how he became a pilot, and his missions over to France, they get shut down, blah, blah, blah. And then he's talking about the part where he's in Buchenwald. And people start whispering, and he hears, they're chuckling. And nobody believed him. And even a senior Army officer told Joe there were no Americans in Buchenwald. That didn't happen. If you say it was, then you're a liar. So his own friends and neighbors disbelieved him. They thought he was trying to make himself come out like a hero. And they said, there were no Americans in Buchenwald. What are you talking about? That was where the Jews died. There were no, the Poles and the Czechoslovakians and the Hungarians. No Americans. So he did not talk about it again until for 40 years. He had nightmares every night because he had kept all his stuff inside. One of the things that helped is while these guys were in Buchenwald, they formed something called the Klb Club. It was another way, psychological way. It was a club. They said, we're going to have a club, and when we get out of here years from now, we're going to have a convention. And it was just it was a joke. It was a way to just keep their spirits up. In 1979, they had their first convention. And all these men who came to it, not everyone made it, because some of them had nothing to do with it. And some have since passed away. But when they got together, they could tell each other their stories. Because they don't believe each other, they were there. And gradually, more and more of them opened up and opened up and opened up. And it eventually did lead to a trip to Buchenwald that Joe participated in, which was a healing experience for some of them and a bad idea for some of the others. Yes, sir.
It sounds like the official position of the United States government was that it didn't happen. When did that change? When did they decide it did happen, the government?
Well, the United States government, I'm not blaming them for this, but they discouraged, they didn't actively order these guys, don't talk about it, but they discouraged them talking about it because they thought it might possibly be embarrassing that, people are going to think we knew they were there, we didn't do anything about it. And there might have been members of the military that knew that there were Allied pilots in Buchenwald. It's really not sure. I haven't found declassified documents about that. But gradually, it became acknowledged that these men had experienced that, especially as more and more able to talk about it. Philip Lamison, for example, I think it was when he was in his 80s, that the New Zealand government finally recognized that he and several others in New Zealand and Australia had been prisoners of war, including stay in Buchenwald, and they should be compensated. and he received $13,000. Which bought a cow for his farm, you know. It came in handy, he's not gonna turn it back. Yeah, don't we suck up other hands? Oh, yes,
You don't follow up on Colonel Troutloff? What happened to him?
Colonel Troutloff, he continued in the Luftwaffe. He was fired in early 1945 for plotting against Hitler, to try to overthrow Hitler. He hated the idea of more pilots dying for what had become a useless cause. He sort of stayed under the radar. I mean, he was one of the fortunate ones that he didn't die because he plotted against Hitler. When the war was over, he went back to his family. When a new German Air Force was formed, I think it was in 1948 or something like that, he was asked to return, and he retired about 20 years later as a brigadier general of the German Air Force. When the Klb Club had their conventions, they always, occasionally, Troutloff I don't think ever came to one. He was invited. I don't think he ever came to one. Lamson made a couple of them, but during their conventions, they always took a moment to salute Troutloff and Lamson, the two colonels who really helped him survive. So, how's that? All right. You don't be sick of it, right? That's enough. I brought some books, if anybody wants them. I can certainly sign them if you want. I'll have to get them from the back table. They retail for $30, but the Rogers Memorial Library discount means $20. And actually, some of you have come to any of my talks before, you'll know I brought my famous can of cash. You can make change out of my chock full of nuts can. It's very high-tech stuff. But anyway, whatever, if you get a book or not, that's fine. You've been so great to come. The weather's not good. I'm so grateful that you came out to hear me talk, or patient, courteous enough to let me get to the finish of it. And thank you very much. I hope you get a chance to.
Thank you.